And it's this notion of a Jewish power which makes anti-Semitism different from other types of racism. Some people refer to it as anti-Semitism punching up and not only down, meaning that racists will often demean or they'll denigrate people of other races or religions as being lower or of less worth. And anti-Semitism, in a sense, punches up because it accuses Jews or Zionists of being controlling.
You see, it's important to understand the definition because, as you said, anti-Semitism has been recently understood just as a form of discourse, but we have seen that anti-Semitism led to also to violence, and we have just seen this extreme violence against the Jewish communities in southern Israel on October 7th. But before we go into this, what has been the state of anti-Semitism, let's say in the last decade, before we got to a critical movement like October 7th?
Sure. I mean, I'll start by speaking about the experience in the UK, because that's where I work and with which I'm familiar. I would say that we have seen different peaks and troughs in terms of when anti-Semitic incidents arise here in the UK, and recording incidents of anti-Jewish hate crime is one of the core functions that CST fulfills, whereby members of the public from across the UK, within the Jewish community, outside the Jewish community, can report acts of anti-Jewish hate crime that they themselves experience as victims or that others do. And what we see is, unfortunately, a recurring pattern whereby when there are conflicts abroad, most often in the Middle East, most often when Israel is involved, that there will be an uptick, sometimes a very dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incidents here in the UK, targeting British Jews as representatives of the State of Israel, or as opportunities for people to lash out or take out their hatred, their anger against Jews whom they see as local manifestations of that which they hate. If I think of it in terms of the statistics or the numbers that we at CST have recorded in the last 10 years. So for example, if I look at, or I think about 2013, so exactly a decade ago, in the whole of that year, we recorded something around 540 or so anti-Semitic incidents. That wasn't a year where there was any significant conflict in the Middle East, and there weren't any significant other types of trigger events. And CST was well known already in 2013. We've been a charity, an organized charity, since 1994, so we were certainly on the map. So it's not only the fact that, perhaps people didn't know about us and wouldn't report. There was lower numbers. And then we see spikes, as I just mentioned a moment ago, when there are different trigger events, such as these conflicts abroad. So in 2014, the numbers spiked dramatically from, I think what I said was 540 to just over or just around 1,200 incidents. And that's in the span of a year. And then we see just an upward trajectory in terms of the numbers. So the trend is an upward trend. And we've seen those numbers, upward trend, but with some decreases, and then continuing in that sort of pattern. That brings us to 2021, where it was the most significant conflict between Israel and Hamas prior to the October 7 attacks, which you've already mentioned. And in 2021 was the highest level of anti-Semitic incidents we'd ever recorded, which was 2,260 incidents in a single year. And many of those were related to the conflict. The numbers then went down, they normalized, and then we are where we are. And I'm happy to get into that when we get into October the 7th. So we've seen those types of trends taking place over the last decade.
So, Iran, now we are in October 7th. Take us there and tell us about the situation, the immediate surge of anti-Semitism. What type of anti-Semitism? What you work as a threat analyst. What type of threat emerged? How does it differ from the past? Any changing trends?
Sure. So there were a number of impressions that we had in the early days, and I'll start with the first few days or weeks, and then I'll give the total picture as best as I can. Already within a few hours of the attacks being broadcast on social media and in the news, as they were becoming more reported on, we already started to see increased incidents of a change in tone and pace in what was taking place online as well as offline. The first incident, anti-Semitic incident, that we recorded was just before 1 p.m. on the 7th of October. And that involved a vehicle driving past a synagogue in a county neighboring London with a large Jewish population. It had a Palestinian flag attached to it. The windows were wound down, and the occupant was shaking fists in the air towards the synagogue. Now, this is very interesting because a Palestinian flag in and of itself is certainly not an anti-Semitic emblem. And that actual activity in and of itself and similar incidents that we've experienced in and of themselves wouldn't necessarily be treated as an anti-Semitic incident. But because they were targeting for abuse a synagogue in the hours just after the attack, it was sort of a foreshadow of some of the examples, other hate crime incidents that we recorded. So in the week following the 7th of October, we were already recording just under 420 anti-Jewish hate incidents, which was higher than any single week that we'd ever had. And we've been recording numbers since the late 1980s. And our concern was that it sort of paralleled the mood on the streets of the UK as well as other locations around the world, where it felt like there was a celebration of the attacks of October the 7th. So even before there was any significant Israeli military response, which would generate and has generated the kinds of protests that we've seen. But even before all that, there were demonstrations, sort of these impromptu or short notice demonstrations taking place, in which they were celebrating. The atmosphere and the imagery was one more of celebration of the so-called resistance rising. And we saw that reflected in the type of incidents that were being reported to us and the pace in which they were being reported to us. If I may, I'll just give you an example. I mean, we have at least 427 or so instances, so just under 430 instances, in which the words "Free Palestine" were used in speech or in writing in an anti-Semitic way. And I'll explain that very, very clearly because I don't want any of the listeners to misunderstand. Just as I said about the Palestinian flag before, so too with Free Palestine, those words are not anti-Semitic. They may upset some people when they are said in a neutral space, but that is not something that CST would be monitoring in and of itself. That is not something that we would proactively look to record as an anti-Semitic incident. However, when it is used to target members of the British Jewish community as a way of expressing their rage or their hatred of Israel or their anger at what is taking place, sort of using Jews, again, as I said before, as local proxies of what is taking place in a foreign conflict, then it is an expression of racism, of anti-Jewish sentiment in that regard. And this is theme that comes again and again. And I'm happy to elaborate on other examples as well as we continue.
Yes, please, it would be